This isn't an ego trip, but I want to commemorate this occasion in a way that I can put up onto YouTube, and those who couldn't be here can join in later on. Now, as the machine already gave away, I'm starting out with a familiar voice.
I'm standing in my garage with a Calrec Soundfield microphone, and I just wish to prove how dramatic the dynamic range of real life is. I'm going to go through the door in front of you. I'm outside now, and probably you can just barely hear me.
Now, those of you who are familiar with this will have detected that the banging on the door I have reduced by 14 dB.
Yep.
If I had not done so, the cones of these speakers would be across the room somewhere. I'm told that there have been a lot of systems ruined by playing that recording too ambitiously. Now, it was the Soundfield microphone that brought me and Mike together in the first place. I was introduced to the existence of it by Bob Wilford, who heard a demonstration before there was actually a model of it on sale, and some years later, through a process that I won't take up the time describing, I came to the point where I really wanted a Soundfield microphone on loan to record a concert which involved a quadraphonic sound projection of a pre-recorded tape. And by accident, I found in a magazine the fact that this, whoever he was, Mike Skeet, had the Soundfield available for rental, and I phoned him up, and it was as if I were a child in a playground who had made contact with the local drug salesman, because I had the use of this microphone for a month because nobody else needed it. So I did the recording that I got it for, and then I had other recordings coming up, and I used it and used it again. And at the end of the month, Mike called apologetically and said, "Terribly sorry, but somebody else is online for it, and I'm going to need it back." And so the first thing that I did was to buy myself a Mark IV immediately. And it was my life from then on. There is so much that one can say about Mike. Mike and I had so much in common as it developed. One of the things that we had in common was that we both had had wives who had to suffer the results of our following our respective stars. And Mike and I used to say that if we were to do a recording session on 2 successive days, and one of us was to go in with our equipment and set it up, do the session, and then on the other day, the other of us came in, set up all of our equipment, and did the recording. The 2 sessions could have been intercut without any noticeable difference between the 2 of them. We heard alike. But now there's a bit more of Mike to be heard here. I won't play all of this, but I'm sure you're all aware of the little record that he put out, binaural stereo, with a bunch of samples of things that he had recorded binaurally. And I include that because Mike is here again.
It's St. John Smith Square, and Michael Ponder's about to come in. Coming past the curtain.
Oh, this is a head, isn't it?
But my dear boy, have a look on the back.
What's that?
No wires. Mini disc.
Christ, is it any good?
Brilliant. I have not used it at a concert yet, but I intend to record certain concerts by just walking in, sticking this in no wires, and walking off.
I'm just going to play a couple more tracks.
That was the keys of the car. The door shutting. The key in the lock. The security lights come on. A dog. The dog sees his head, we're in dead trouble.
Well, there's a small sample. Appropriately, I played this on a pair of vintage AR2AXs that go back to about 1970 or thereabouts, and I put a display out over there of some of Mike's CDs that I've accumulated over the years. And the reason that I put out that Stella box is because Mike, used to buy in job lots of equipment from people, and one of them, going back about 25 or 30 years, included a Stella box with all of its outrigger equipment, and nobody was interested in it back then. And he knew that I was interested in a Stella box, and he made me a present of it. And it's been sitting around idle ever since, but it's come out just as a tie-in with Mike. Now the last thing that I want to say is Mike is the person who should be giving the talk here today. That's not possible, but in going through my computer for things related to him, I ran across a copy of an article that he wrote up back, about 10 years ago or so, which he intended as a draft for a magazine, possibly. It was never published, but it sums up a whole lot of what Mike was, I think, and he entitled it The Black Art of Audio Recording and Reproduction. And I'll read through this with a certain speed. There are an enormous number of variables involved in the recording of audio and in reproduction. Perhaps that could be the attraction of the ongoing endeavor to capture a stereo soundstage, retaining as much of the reality as possible in the playback, knowing that it will never be perfect. The major areas of variability are in the choices of microphones, the variations in the way they are used to capture the stereo soundstage, how many are in use, their placement in the acoustic, the characteristics of that acoustic, and the judgments made in whatever monitoring room is available, apart from the loudspeakers in use. Whatever is finally available to the home listener is then subject to another plethora of variables, and it is on this aspect that I want to start. First of all, the playback. A number of years ago, I recorded in dozens of different listening rooms with different playback systems the sound of one particular CD. In each case is near to a similar sweet spot, symmetrical to the speakers, at like volume levels. The recordings were made via binaural mics in my ears. Playback comparisons were then made via quality open-back headphones. These playbacks were all entirely different, let alone the one where the speakers were out of phase and another where the tweeters were defunct. Apart from differences in loudspeakers, there was their placement, symmetrical to the room or otherwise, the room sizes, their dimensional proportions and reflections, low frequency responses, furniture layout, and floor covering. There's obviously never going to be a playback standard, but there are perhaps some ways of reducing the multifarious number of effects mentioned above. Inherent in this is the construction of your property. Solid brick interior walled rooms are different to timber-framed, panel-constructed interiors, as I noticed when I had moved to the latter type, which I straight away preferred. Traffic resonance was obviously noticeable in the earlier home, but not so much now in the wooden environment. However, this would also be a factor in the low-frequency reproduction of the loudspeakers, as also would be the size of the room apart from the loudspeaker's design characteristics and positioning. You can't win. Loudspeaker manufacturers favor a number of choices of design types. For electromagnetic drivers, there are sealed boxes or various ported types, an extension of this being the transmission line. Electrostatic loudspeakers justifiably have their enthusiasts. However, you do have to consider their positioning due to their bidirectional output. There is a characteristic of a well-known electrostatic loudspeaker that I used to have. This was the point source of the full frequency range reproduced. This is also a noticeable facet of some dual concentric cones and high frequency drivers that I have used. With 2 or 3 driver designs, it is likely that they will be vertically in line, or at least the mid and the high ought to be. These aspects are considered to be an important factor in obtaining clear imaging. So, if your loudspeakers are as symmetrical to the room as possible, away from corners and walls, preferably angled in to the sweet spot, not like this, it is worth checking out that you get a clear center image with a mono recording. With passive loudspeakers, you could temporarily wire both from the same amplifier output to directly test the speakers themselves. Now, the timbre tonality differences or colorations between the original sound and what is reproduced are likely to be more from the loudspeaker playback than due to what the microphones added, or of a different nature entirely. An aspect to consider is that boxed loudspeakers can radiate a sound from their side and rear panels. Electrostatic loudspeakers are inherently free of this box effect. Similar to why some recording people really like ribbon microphones, ? Now, the recording. I don't know if it is definable what we should expect from the reproduced stereo soundstage. My view is that the loudspeakers as individual sound sources should not be directly noticeable. The stereo should start in the middle and spread out towards the loudspeakers with a good imaging, a balance of instrumental sources between the loudspeakers, and a detachment of the recording venue's ambience behind and wider than the performers. It was interesting that in the early days, in the move to stereo, there was a ping-pong approach to MIDI recordings, where you had mono instruments coming direct from each of the loudspeakers. Mind you, I've recently heard a 5.1 surround sound DVD of a string quartet where you have placed the violins fully in the front, left and right loudspeakers, with the viola and cello coming from two rear loudspeakers. I don't know of any concerts where you could get the audience to sit in the middle of a string quartet. However, microphones are definably used closer to the performers than almost any of the audience, ever. In addition to that, there are often difficulties in using the layout that some groups of performers always want to follow to get a decent musical and stereo soundstage balance among themselves. Consider brass bands and smaller ensembles like string quartets. The former have two major groups of performers directly facing each other, with a third group at the back of the performing area, with, of course, the percussion between them. If only those two groups to the conductor's left and right could be opened out, their instrumental sounds would come over much more naturally on the main pair above and behind the conductor. Now, with string quartets, etc., they are obviously so used to rehearsing in much smaller areas than the concert platform, and so do easily hear each other's contribution. In the string quartet's case, the balance from the second violin and the viola are often compromised unless they can be persuaded to open out a bit. So, on to variety of approaches which are possible at the recording stage and in the subsequent post-production, as it is known. There are many different overall microphone techniques in use. Different recording engineers tend to specialize with a particular approach. It must be said that their experiences with a given way of doing it can mean that they have honed their techniques over time to their own preferences. Some believe in a minimalist approach and often get away with a single pair of mics suitably placed in a given acoustic, with the layout of the performers often suiting the results in terms of balance and imaging. This pair approach can be with directional mics, usually cardioid, human ear placed apart and angled, say 90 to 120 degrees. Not many use two vertically coincident directional mics angled at 90 degrees, one above the other. Little stereo width is a noticeable result. Others prefer to use non-directional mics, omni, spaced apart more than the ear spacing mentioned earlier. There is, in fact, a basic reason for the use of non-directional mics. They have a more extended low-frequency range than directional mics usually have. For some, the downside is poor imaging and a tendency for the stereo to collapse to one or the other loudspeaker. if the listener moves even a little from the sweet spot. However, in this horses for courses world, the use of omnis with piano recordings can be good. Now, recording the use of two microphones, there is a system called mid and slide, used by some, where you have a mid microphone facing to the center soundstage, directional or non-directional, and vertically coincident with it, a side bidirectional mic, figure of 8, picking up the sound from either side of the mid mic. The signals are mixed with the mid mic in phase to the stereo and the side mic mixed out of phase to the stereo. The technique actually covers the center of the sound stage. The stereo starts in the middle, spreads out symmetrically towards the loudspeakers with a variable stereo width available with the amount of the side mic signal which is fed into the mix. There is a famous 3-mic rig known as the Deca-Tree. 3 omnis are used, 2 spaced around a meter apart and the center one out in the front around a meter forward. It's thought that the famous Neumann mics originally used were quite directional above 5K, and this significantly aided the imaging obtained. Some recording engineers do not like extra spot mics, but there are occasions when they do need to be used to get a musical balance. The skill is that they should not really be noticed in the mix. Going too close can certainly be evident, and an often consequence is that more and more are then put out. If the aim is to achieve a depth perspective in the stereo sound stage, it soon becomes evident that close mics are definitely out there. I don't know if there is a world record for the number of mics used on an orchestra, but 60 are known to have been used. An interesting development in the current use of spot mics is for their feed into the mix to be delayed at milliseconds related to their distance from the main mics. More easily done nowadays than in the past, and practiced by many recording engineers in getting a proper musical balance and a depth perspective in the stereo image. And finally, post-production. Razor blades with reel-to-reel tape was the skilled way of editing in the past. Nowadays, computer program editing, the use of a visual waveform, is an amazing advance. The amount of editing needed to be done varies a lot. It's recognized that too many cuts between takes do not always maintain the feel of a performance. There is a particular aspect of post-production that is also important to the listener's experience. Wide excursions of the dynamic range, which are perfectly fine in a live performance, do need to be sensibly dealt with for any domestic playback. I'm certainly not advocating the mad situation current with most pop music, where the levels across the songs are pushed up to the digital limit and the whole thing bashes along at 0. This is in pursuit of loudness as the selling point. The old Beatles stuff and other CDs of that era are not like that. With classical music, it is perfectly acceptable to trim any wide excursions in level, done progressively to keep the sense of dynamic range, and that way allowing the overall average level of the performance to be raised and more interesting to listen to. I know of 2 CDs where the dynamics as recorded at the sessions and with the headroom that has to be there to avoid a sudden peak going over the top was not allowed to be trimmed. A reviewer of one complained that the levels were all over the place. With another, which was at a particularly low level for the opening 3 minutes, had the reviewer's complaint that he had 5 attempts to get the level right to suit the 30 dB leap at the very pronounced tutti. It's believed that the composer, on receiving his issued CD copy, turned up the initial volume to suit the music at the start, and at the 3-minute point, his tweeters ceased to exist. Final thoughts. A sort of unanswered question, to use the name of the work by Charles Ives. Is there likely to be an important phase relationship over the audio spectrum heard in the live recording situation that is not maintained at any replay situation, particularly due to microphone imperfections in that area, along with what phase corruption every loudspeaker playback must contribute to it? Just a thought. To conclude, it is definitely a fact that the number of variables at the recording process and more of them at the listener's playback are the main stumbling blocks in achieving a good listening experience. It makes me wonder if the 24-bit 96K and beyond will ever be noticeable, especially when we have DAB radio at around a seventh or below the bit rate of the CD Redbook standard. That apart from what the iPod and the MP3 deliveries do and what happens with music downloads. Some years ago, I was approached by a well-known ensemble who asked if I could lend them or hire them some mics to record their next concert, as they had just acquired a 96K sampling DAT recorder. I asked them what kind of mics they would like. They said, it didn't matter. It was a very short phone call. So thank you, Mike. I've done my best to make Mike the person to introduce himself and not me. Now you can eat.